My name is Jason, and welcome to Uncanny Stew, where we mix together a concoction of weird tales and weirder AI art. On today's menu is a suspenseful short story from Gene Preen. It's man versus monster in a post-apocalyptic nightmare. Today's stew is called Killer of the Cave. Like a man drugged, Don Newman had been sitting on the soft earth outside the mouth of the underground cave, looking into the distance. Hope had left his eyes, even the fear that had replaced it, and now they stared blankly as though a shade had been lowered behind them to shut out the scene of a world that had ended, a world that had been scorched clean of all living things, both good and evil, with atomic power unleashed by man's hatred. The soft loam beneath him was just a strip around the cave, all that was left in existence. Beyond it, the strangely crystalline sand that only a month earlier had been the same loam verdant with foliage before it had been transformed by the alchemy of atomic fission, stretched endlessly toward the horizon where warped naked steel girders marked the grave of a city. In the lowering twilight, the sand had begun to glow weirdly. It became a sea of cold luminescence, and in it a host of charred white skeletons of men and animals lay half submerged like ghostly swimmers struggling to reach his small island of life. And the cave had been a real island of life in the vast deluge of death. Its natural magnetic ore had been an impermeable fortress shielding him and his companions against the bombardment of nuclear radiation. But death had long known other ways of killing. A chill suddenly shook Newman's motionless figure. His eyes cleared, and he turned to look down the strip of earth towards a spot where a number of graves were marked by shallow mounds. Originally, there had been 8 people, including Newman himself. All had miraculously escaped the Holocaust and had been the last living creatures on the world. Now 6 of them lay buried there, murdered by an inhuman creature spawned by the same radiation they had escaped. For a minute, Newman shook his head insanely from side to side, as though trying to dislodge the memory from his brain. Alice, would she ever forgive him? As he struggled to his feet, a photograph dropped from his pocket, a portrait of the killer taken with a camera he'd rigged as a trap. He picked it up, looked at it. The face of a monster leered back at him. In a frenzy, he tore the photograph to shreds and flung the pieces to the empty world. Without turning on his flashlight, he stumbled into the dark mouth of the cave. As he groped his way down the long stone ramp leading to the main cavern, voices seemed to whisper to him from the darkness. Voices of the countless curious sightseers who had once traveled great distances to experience the mysteries of this underground fairyland, where a subterranean stream flowed uphill, and where they could strap metal soles to their shoes so they could walk upside down on its polished ceiling, and where their car keys would float in the air by themselves, perfectly balanced between the ore's magnetic fields. He and the others had constituted the last party of visitors. Alice, his fiancée, had been one of them. His job with the homicide division had become hectic with all the recent foreign intrigue, but she had persuaded him to take the trip. The others he'd come to know too well in the days that followed the sudden start and equally sudden end of the suicidal A-war. Now he wished he had died mercifully in it. He had felt the tremors in the earth when the first bombs were dropped in some distant country, and thought he was imagining them because there was something about the cave that gave everybody strange sensations. That's what the guide had said. Then one bomb fell nearby. How near? 100 miles would have been close enough. The cave was shaken as though by a giant hand, and its occupants were hurled across the floor. After that, there was a moment of stupefied silence, then panic. Everyone rushed to the cave's mouth and saw the world give its last convulsive shudder. It was amazing that most of them kept their sanity. 2 didn't. The guide ran screaming across the earthen moat surrounding the cave, vanished into the molten cauldron beyond. The nurse from the first aid room followed him, perhaps to try to save him. Newman never found out. He ran after her, clutched her arm as she reached the edge, released it when the overflow of radiation struck him like a blast from a giant blowtorch. The survivors returned underground then. There was little conversation. Everyone was too stunned and walked around like zombies. When their shock eventually wore off, there would come the full realization of what happened, and then all hell would break loose. To forestall it, there had to be some stabilizing influence, someone who could supply a straw of hope which these trapped people could grasp. Perhaps he could do it, since he had been through it before. He had assembled them in a small wooden structure at one end of the cave, which had served as a first aid room and a kind of commissary. There was stocky, bearded Vladimir Simonov of the Russian diplomatic service, who seemed as surprised as anyone else that it finally had happened, and F. Raymond Pine of the U.S. Consulate's office, a fragile slip of a man who couldn't conceal his suspicion of the Russian. A mustached, swarthy Dr. Raoul Mitvini, doctor of what Newman never had a chance to discover, had brought his pretty blonde nurse, Katie Allen, on the tour. Her exact relationship to the doctor was unknown but suspect. There were two teenagers, a boy and a girl. The latter was more scared than Newman had ever seen anyone, but the boy was obviously unfriendly, had sullen, furtive eyes, and refused any information except that his name was John and the girl's Mary. Newman looked them over grimly. Besides Alice and himself, there were these 4 men and 2 women. All of you know what happened outside. We're alive because this place is somehow impervious to radiation, and no reason why we shouldn't continue to live. The stream comes from inside the earth. It should be uncontaminated by radiation, therefore fit to drink. It contains fish. He remembered reading in the brochure that the stream contained hordes of blind cave fish. That will provide us with food to supplement the commissary's provisions when they run out. And since the electric lights are still on, there must be a power plant somewhere. I suggest we explore every corner of the cavern and collect everything usable. From the manner in which they took up the search, Newman knew the crisis had been averted, at least temporarily. With the diesel power plant were a dozen 50-gallon drums of oil, enough to keep the cavern lighted until its occupants were sufficiently adjusted to tolerate rationing it. Also several flashlights, one of which he shoved into his pocket. A closet behind the commissary was packed with canned food, probably stashed away by the guide for an emergency. 3 weeks passed uneventfully, but there persisted an atmosphere of tension, a strange barrier to friendliness among the survivors. Newman tried to relieve it by creating diversionary interests and received no cooperation. The doctor and his nurse kept to themselves, carrying on whispered conversations, as did the teenagers. The Russian spent his time avoiding everyone, especially the little American diplomat, and the latter seemed angry with everyone for not recognizing that the Russian was to blame for everything. That night, the first murder occurred. The diesel generator had been turned off. Sometime towards the morning, the cave was awakened by hoarse shouts in Russian. Newman switched on his flashlight. Simonov and Pine, the American, were rolling around on the floor, the latter's fingers clutching the Russian's throat. With the help of the doctor, he pulled the men apart. Look, Pine screamed, pointing. He did it! Newman shifted the beam of his light. It fell on a still figure lying face up nearby. The boy! Newman bent over him. A glance told him he was dead. His throat had been torn open either by human hands or the claws of a beast. With the generator started and the lights on, Newman sat with his back to the cave wall, Alice clutching him tightly while he tried to think. The murderer was one of the 5, of course, since there were no beasts. But which of them was physically capable of tearing out a man's throat? Newman questioned everyone. No one had seen anything immediately prior to the murder. They had all been asleep. Pine denied emphatically he had done it, looked at his accuser as though Newman had suddenly gone mad. There was nothing Newman can do without proof. He decided to wait. They buried the body in the earth outside the cave. Then there was the second murder on the following night. It was Pine. His throat had been torn out, as had the boy's. Now Newman was sure he knew the identity of the murderer. Who else could it be but Simonov? Obviously he had killed Pine to quiet him. It took both Newman and the doctor to subdue the husky Russian sufficiently to put handcuffs on him. Then with a rope, they tied him to the metal guardrail of the ramp. A trial was planned for the next morning, everyone participating, and if found guilty, Simonoff would be given a choice. Either he could walk voluntarily into the radioactive no man's land beyond the cave, or he'd be thrown into it. Newman hoped he would choose the former. As they had buried the second body, Newman prayed fervently it would be the last. Sometime during the day, he suddenly remembered once having seen Pine with a Polaroid camera, the kind that produced a self-processed picture in a minute, and it had had the flash attachment on it. If he could find it, he could secretly set it so its lens would take in the spot where Dr. Mitvini slept, also the place where Simonoff was tied, and even the door of the room where the women were sleeping. And he could attach a heavy thread to its shutter release, stretching it across the cave floor in such a way that if any of them got up during the night and walked into the thread, it would trip the shutter and take the person's picture. Such a device would be a good precautionary measure on the slight chance that Simonoff might be innocent, and the murderer might decide to strike again. Newman searched for Pine's outfit, found it, and when he was sure the rest were asleep at night, he rigged it up as he'd planned. For a long time, he lay with his hand on his revolver before he dozed off. In the morning, Simonoff was dead, killed the same way, without uttering a sound anyone had heard. They didn't find him until the lights had been turned on. The thread of the camera was intact. Somehow, the course the murderer had taken had avoided it. As soon as Newman saw the body, without hesitation, he drew his revolver and held it on the doctor. The man was the only logical suspect that remained. Surely neither the girl nor the nurse, the pretty blonde, would be able to commit such murders of violence. Newman had just transferred the handcuffs from the dead Russian to the doctor and tied him to the rail in spite of his protests when the nurse appeared. She quickly saw what had happened, sprang at Newman like a tigress, fought him with the strength of a maniac. It was all Newman could do to hold her wrists with their wildly clawing fingers. With blood running from numerous scratches on his arms and face, he led her to the first aid room where he gave her a sedative, and giving his revolver to his fiancée with instructions to watch her, he left and climbed the ramp towards the entrance. Somehow the daylight of the old dead world seemed like a refuge from the darkness of the dying one, which reeked of fresh death. For a long while he sat outside. The sun shone as a fuzzy disk through the high clouds of dust that had mushroomed up from the atomic explosions and were still circulating across the stratosphere. As he watched them, he remembered a term nuclear scientists had used: radioactive fallout. Regardless of what they had meant by it, now he had his own definition. They were the fallout. He and the others who had escaped the radioactivity. Escaped for what? To play cat and mouse with a homicidal killer? There were 5 left. He could have prevented 2 of the murders if he had guessed right the first time, but now he had the doctor, and he couldn't be wrong. Who else was there? The nurse and the teenage girl? But if he were wrong once more, impossible. Even so, that night he set up the camera again, focused directly at his prisoner, and he tried desperately, but in vain, to keep awake. The next morning, there was a 4th victim, throat torn, crumpled on the floor between Alice and the girl. It was the nurse. Newman didn't know what to do or say. He was totally confused, and for the first time, fear began to distort his reasoning. His fiancée and the girl became hysterical when they realized how close death had come to them. Newman gave each a sedative from the first aid kit, then took one himself. He fought to clear his brain. As his nerves grew calmer, one fact gradually became plain. It was that the doctor was innocent. He couldn't have killed his nurse, even if he'd had a motive, because he was handcuffed to the rail. Newman released him, noticing as he did so that again the thread to the camera hadn't been touched. This time, the murderer's victim lay in a different direction. He returned and started to put handcuffs on the girl. She was the only one left. Alice stopped him. Don't, please. Don't you see she's not the one? It's not any of us. It's something out there. She threw her arms around him, sobbing. Suddenly, she felt strange against his body. He looked at the young girl, at the doctor. They blurred before his eyes and he slumped to the floor. He saw the doctor move as a shadow, then felt a knife pierce his brain. As his vision grew sharp, he brushed aside the hand in front of his face. The ammonia did its job quickly, but Newman was still weak. The doctor's voice sounded hollow, as from a long way off. "Rest a while. You'll be all right. But I do think your fiancé is correct, Newman. There is some wild beast here with us, and we must stop it before." He completed the sentence with a shrug of his shoulders. That night, Newman set the camera facing the end of the cavern, and in addition, they all took turns standing guard with the revolver, and they left the lights on. It happened after Newman's watch. Too tired to stay awake, he dropped off into a troubled sleep and didn't awaken the doctor, whose turn was next. Later, he was aware of someone shaking his shoulder roughly. When he opened his eyes, it was to find the fifth murder. The teenager's slight figure lay twisted on the floor, blood staining the front of her dress. The doctor was standing over her, holding the revolver. As he turned towards Newman, the latter half expected him to raise the gun and shoot, but the man scarcely saw him. His eyes, too, had become clouded with fear. Newman looked at Alice. Her face was white, expressionless, as she stared at the cave wall. He should have known then. They ate little that day, were like 3 condemned people awaiting the executioner. They were safe until nightfall, since the killer seemed to strike only then, but they knew the night with its menace would surely come, and as though to quicken the end, in the afternoon the lights suddenly flickered several times, then went out. With their flashlights, they made their way to the generator, Newman holding his revolver ready. Then he passed it to the doctor while he tried in vain to fix the small diesel engine. The trouble might have been slight, but he couldn't find it. His mind was whirling too rapidly for him to concentrate. After an hour, he gave up in despair. They returned to the foot of the ramp and began their guard watches immediately. This time, Newman remained awake during his turn. It was after he passed the revolver to the doctor and was in the throes of another nightmare that Mitvini was murdered. Newman couldn't recall too clearly had he passed the day that followed. He'd buried the last body, then he'd remained outside in the daylight, huddled against the rock with Alice next to him. She had kept staring at him silently, queerly, with blanched face and vacant eyes. Then, when the twilight had fallen, he had dragged her back into the cave. There was something about the eerie luminescence of the wasted earth that had been more maddening than even the unknown death lurking below. He remembered the rays of his flashlight had accidentally fallen on the camera. It lay on its side, its back open as though a picture had been taken and someone had removed it. "Alice, the camera!" he shouted. "The picture!" She had trembled at his side, and a second later forced something into his hand. It had been the picture he had shined the light at, looked in bewilderment at the figure of the beast with hairy body and cruel face, but wearing the clothes of a human being. It was kneeling by the stream, washing its clawed hands in the water. He had screamed and lost his senses. He had been sitting outside the cave when he regained consciousness. The night had passed, also another day, and twilight was descending once more. After the long rest, his brain had functioned for a while with its old clarity, and he had been thinking. He started to leave. Then the picture had fallen from his pocket and he had destroyed it. Why not? There would be no one to see. Newman staggered down the ramp. When he reached the bottom, he turned on the flashlight and searched the floor of the cavern. He knew what he was seeking. He found Alice's body, knelt beside it, and gathered it in his arms. He ignored the blood that stained his hands and his clothing. She was his Eve. And wasn't he her Adam? He laughed, more in bitterness now than madness. It must have begun the first day when the blast of radiation had hit him and seared him as he was trying to pull back the girl from the sea of fire. And for 3 weeks, the insidious poison had worked on his mind and body, twisting and distorting them. The picture had been more proof than he'd needed. It had been of him, himself, radioactivity, and he was the fallout. He felt the hair again beginning to bristle on his arms, felt his fingers swelling into long talons. This time, he'd killed the murderer. He groped, for his revolver. And that tasty morsel was Killer of the Cave by Gene Preen. You can read that intense short story for yourself, plus many more, in Atomic Werewolves and Man-Eating Plants. Link in the description down below. I hope you enjoyed today's Uncanny Stew. Thank you for joining me for this steaming bowl of the weird and the wonderful. I post a new story every Friday, so be sure to click the little bell icon below to be notified. Take care, and I'll see you next time.